If you want to pick a symbol, an icon of American economic growth, you'd probably go with the train and railroads. That's just constantly that symbol of economic progress. And it is probably pretty correct, right? That is where we started seeing the invention of engines. We started seeing mass transit. We're seeing so many things come from railroads. But the question is, how much did railroads cause American economic development? How much did they actually cause growth? And cause is a tricky word here. We want to understand what cause means, and then we want to understand whether railroads caused economic development in America. And I really hope you understand cause and effect here in the situation. What do we mean when we say cause and effect? Well, to discern whether something caused an effect, we need to have a counterfactual. Now, the word counterfactual comes from fact, something that happened, and counter, something that goes against it. We need to know what would have happened if that thing had not happened. Does that make sense to you right there? Let me break that down a little bit. Counterfactuals are the parallel universes that we get to see what would have happened if we had made another choice. We get to see what would have happened if this big event had not happened. That is the counterfactual, and that is the first thing you should ask anytime someone tells you that this caused that. You should think, what is the counterfactual? What is the world that you're comparing that to? Now, here's the thing about counterfactuals. They are literally impossible to see. We cannot see that. We do not have a DeLorean to take us back in time and see the counterfactual. And in fact, this is a great example of counterfactuals. At the beginning of Back to the Future, Marty is there with his family and they're talking about how the enchantment under the sea dance is what caused the life they have that day. It caused them to get married. It caused everything that happened. Well, Marty goes back to that exact day. He interferes with that cause, and he actually starts to see that that path is changing, that he's starting to disappear. And then he does a few more things, and we see a completely different life. We see two different outcomes in the future. One of them is the counterfactual for the other. This is what would have happened had Marty never intervened. This is what would have happened if Marty intervenes and gets his dad to stand up to Biff. Just a comment right now, actually, like Back to the Future 3, their time machine is a train, right? Showing that icon of economic growth and development, right? Like that is how iconic railroads are. Unfortunately, in real life, we cannot observe what would have happened if things had gone differently. And so this makes finding cause and effect hard. We literally cannot know what would have happened in that world had something else happened. The best we can do is to find something close enough. A country, a state, a city, something that looked very similar beforehand, and we imagine would have continued to follow the same path, but didn't have the exact same outcome. So let's imagine that you're at this university, you have a group of friends together with you in high school. You guys are thick as thieves. You're always doing things. It looks like you guys are on the same path. But then when you decide to go to college, you made the right choice and you came here, and your friend made a terrible choice and went, I don't know, somewhere south, and like, let's say it's like the color is red. I don't know. Well, let's just, hypothetically speaking, they went to a school, red colors, and you're in a school with blue colors. You're making good choices. They're making bad choices. So you might say, hey, we were exactly the same. We were like basically the same person in high school, and now we've gone to two different colleges. What is the causal effect of these colleges on our life outcomes? Well, we would look and see that you making the good decision have a nice, prosperous life, and your friend who made that terrible decision has gone off and made really bad life choices after that. And we would say, well, the choice of university caused that outcome. Still difficult to attribute it. There's a whole bunch of layers behind cause and effect. And that's something that we care a lot about in economics is, whether they chose it, how can we really make the right counterfactual when we're trying to determine cause and effect. But you should always be aware of what the counterfactual is. What would have happened in that world had this cause not occurred? So now let's go back to that railroad question. Did railroads cause American economic development? And this is why it's a hard question. We can't observe the world. without railroads. We don't know what America would have looked like exactly without railroads. Now, we can hypothesize, we can speculate, but it's going to be hard for us to know for sure what the world would have been like without railroads. But since we can't know exactly what it is, what is something that we might hypothesize? How might we compare the world without railroads? What would we have done? This is where Robert Fogel comes in. Robert Fogel is a Nobel Prize winning economist. He won the prize in 1993 for his role in clarifying the role of railroads in economic development and for looking at slavery in American economic development. A lot of the stuff we talked about in the slavery lecture was derived from work that he had done. So Fogel, when he's working on this research agenda of trying to understand railroads, he comes across this article by a man named Leland Jenks. And I just love this guy's name because it always makes me think of Leroy Jenkins.
Let's do this. Leroy Jenkins!
Leland Jenks is arguing that railroads were transformative to the American economy. That we properly worship railroads in our view of American economic growth and industry because look at all the things that happened when we got railroads. He looks at the growth of cities like Atlanta, Chicago, Louisville. He looks at how water transit basically disappeared. The Mississippi River was a huge transit spot for the United States, and basically no one used it once railroads came around. And then he also points to the really high correlation between railroad construction and population growth, saying, look, railroads go here, population goes there, that's economic growth. Now, Fogel's not denying that these facts exist. Like, yes, all these things did happen. But to say that that was caused by the railroads is dicey ground because what would this world have looked like without those railroads? So Fogel just basically outlines a model of shipping. This is like the most basic model of shipping, and he never explicitly says this in his work, but you can imagine this is what's going on behind his work. He has three assumptions. First, you have profit maximizing companies. They need to sell their goods. So Fogel outlines a model of shipping, which, well, okay, he doesn't actually outline it, but this is the assumption going on behind his work. First, people have stuff that they need to sell to other people. Now, they might not be in the same location, right? So you're gonna have to ship your stuff to other people. Second, these people are profit maximizing firms. They are trying to ship their stuff at the lowest cost and get the highest price so that way they can get the biggest profits. And third, which isn't really an assumption as much as it is just fact, high shipping costs reduce profits. If it costs a lot to send my stuff to you, that's going to cut into my profits. So the conclusion here is that people are going to ship their goods via the lowest cost route. In fact, if shipping to you is too expensive, they might choose not to ship to you at all. There's no way that I'm sending this book to some remote location on the other side of the world because shipping costs are just outrageous. And the third conclusion is that the railroad will not drastically affect American economic development if there was another good shipping option available. It's like asking what's the effect of FedEx on the economy when UPS is already around. Yes, FedEx gets you your goods places, but hey, we already have somebody else out there. Maybe it's not that big of an effect. And this is really where Fogel takes issue with Leland Jenks' argument. He's saying, hey, there were other options. There were waterways. And this is why he's really upset that Leland Jenks points to waterways as an example of the effect of railroads. He's saying, at least Fogel is saying, hey, yeah, if a cheaper option shows up, of course they're going to stop using waterways. They're going to go immediately do the railroad because that is just the cheaper thing to do. That's not a sign of economic growth. That's a sign that a slightly cheaper option showed up. So Fogel is saying that it's not whether railroads lowered shipping costs. They definitely did. The question is, did they lower them enough to create transformative economic development? So Fogel comes up with this concept called social savings. Social savings is the idea that there is some sort of savings to society created by the railroad, that we used to do things one way, and now that we've got this new railroad here, this is how much we're saving, and we're able to get so much more economic activity as a result. For him, social savings is going to be the difference between shipping this item via railroad versus shipping it on waterways. Here's a good example. This is a map of New York and the surrounding areas. And let's say you wanted to get something from Cleveland to New York. Well, if there are railroads around, you can just take that railroad straight from Cleveland to New York City. But suppose you didn't have railroads. Let's imagine this counterfactual of a world without railroads. What would you do? Well, if you're in Cleveland, you can actually go up the Great Lakes and you can cut across the Erie Canal and then you can cut down the Hudson River and you will be able to ship your stuff to New York City. There is a connection between Cleveland and New York City. It's not this direct fast connection from railroads, but there is a connection that you can make. And the question is, how much cheaper is it for you to ship stuff from Cleveland to New York City via railroad versus the waterways and canals? This is a really important question because if it's incredibly cheaper, then we're getting more economic activity. People might do things that they had never done before because now it's so much cheaper. This is the whole point of this video right here, right? Like, we could be in person. I could be talking to you one-on-one doing this, but that would be incredibly expensive for me to go out and see this huge audience. But for right now, I can talk to you one-on-one via YouTube because YouTube has drastically cut the cost of delivering video to you. This is an amazing innovation, and so you get more education. You have so many other education channels that you can tune into because we've cut the cost of you getting access to that education. And so we can see pretty big innovations. We've seen big growth in educational content as a result. Are we seeing the same thing with the railroad? Is the railroad drastically cutting costs in other economic activities? So let's pause a second and say, is this even a good counterfactual? Is comparing railroads to waterways a solid counterfactual? And is this going to give us some idea of the impact of railroads? Well, I would argue, yeah, this is like a pretty clever counterfactual to say, like, what would the world have looked like without railroads? Well, we were already using waterways, so we would have just kept using waterways. You know, it's hard to imagine, oh, well, if we didn't invent railroads, we would have invented airplanes, and that, you know, we would have just leapt over the whole railroad phase. Maybe, but at that time, it's not like airplanes were right there, but waterways were. We used the Mississippi River, we used the Hudson River, Erie Canal. We were building out a canal network that was connecting the United States through waterways. Now, we don't actually have the waterways there, so it's going to be a little bit hard to calculate this. We're going to have to assume that trading patterns stay the same, but like a lot of these assumptions aren't that bad. And the end result is going to be, if social savings, if this difference in cost of shipping things via railroad versus waterways and also wagons, I haven't mentioned, obviously you're going to need wagons at some point. If it's so much cheaper there, like, we should see a significant effect on GDP. It should be a significant size of GDP for us to claim that we had significant economic growth as a result of the railroads. Fogel goes through and he grabs all this data. He says, like, okay, how much was being shipped? How much did it cost? All this stuff. And he calculates social savings. And the first thing he finds is pretty surprising. He finds that railroads were actually more expensive than waterways. Now, this should make us question that original model that said people would stop using waterways and use railroads only if railroads was cheaper. But now we've got this calculation that says railroads were actually more expensive. Does that even make sense? Well, this is a very first pass, first blush type of analysis that says, let's just do this without thinking of any of the other benefits. Let's not think of anything else that comes from using the railroads. Let's just do, what does it cost to ship things? And when you look at that very straightforward analysis, you're finding that railroads are more expensive. But there are all these things that he omitted in his analysis. In fact, there are 6 key things that he omitted in his analysis. I'm going to go through all 6 of these omitted costs, and let me just say, Fogel's making this argument that, you know, we should at least see 1% of GDP saved by using the railroads. And if we're gonna get up to 1% of GDP, we need this number to be $158 million in omitted costs. Let's see if this adds up to $158 million. First, he omitted cargo losses in transit. When you are on the waterways, if that boat goes over, or if it even tips a little, like, you could lose all of your cargo and it is not recovered. Like, the boat breaks down, let's say it sinks, you've lost everything, right? Railroads, on the other hand, on the trains, you're not losing your stuff as much. it seems like railroads have safer guarantees on transit. Yeah, a train breaks down, but if that train breaks down, it's just stuck on the tracks. How often do they blow up? I don't know. I mean, they make it seem like you get some cool pyrotechnics out of the railroads, but it seems like your cargo is safer on trains. So the question is, how do you account for how much safer it is? How can you calculate the benefit of how much money you're saving by having safer cargo? Well, I love what he does here because he uses the change in insurance costs. People buy insurance on their cargo when they would use the waterways, and then they would also buy insurance when they're using the railways. And when they do that, if your stuff gets lost less often, if it gets destroyed less often, then you don't have to pay as much in insurance. Insurance is cheaper for people who don't have as many accidents. So if you're shipping on the railroad, you get lower insurance costs. And so we can actually calculate the change in insurance costs there and say, hey, that's the savings that we have here. It's not just shipping things, it's the cost of insuring things. So when we do this calculation on the change of insurance rates, what we find is that savings are about $6 million from changes in insurance. So we're making a step there, but that's a long ways from that $158 million mark. The second omitted cost was trans-shipping charges. These are charges from switching the vehicle that your cargo is on. If you are on the waterways, you might go up the lake and that's one boat, but then you have to switch to a canal boat, which is a different one. And then maybe you have to switch to a wagon. Like, you're doing all these switches, whereas on railroads, you're able to maintain your cargo in the same car for most of the trip. So you might be saving on trans-shipping charges, and we would want to take that into account. He just looks at the data on this and he finds $16 million saved. So we're now starting to get up. Now there's a really important one here, and that is lost time due to the fact that waterways are slow and they're frozen throughout the winter. This is actually two costs, right? The two costs are it's slower and you can't use waterways for a good chunk of the year. So how is Fogel gonna solve this problem? Well, it's not like people hadn't already solved this problem before, right? Like, yes, it's great that these railroads can be used more often and they can be used quicker. Like, yes, these are great solutions, but it's not like people just sat there and starved during the winter because they couldn't buy things from the store. So how did they solve this problem before? They used inventory. You use personal inventory, you use store inventory, right? Like, if you don't think you're going to be able to go out and get food for a while, you're going to stock up your cupboard. Well, stores, if they don't think they're going to get shipments for a while, like over the winter, they're going to make sure that they store a lot of things in their inventory. But inventory takes space. It takes up real estate. That's part of your store that you can't be dedicated to selling things. So inventory has a true cost on your business. So if you can cut down your inventory, that is a way for you to have a more profitable business. In fact, this is what we see. Walmart invented the just-in-time inventory system to cut down on their inventory. They order things and they arrive just in time for when they need them. So, you have cereal is running out of stock. They're keeping track of this, and then they know how long it's going to take for the next shipment of cereal to get there, and they make sure it's ordered to arrive right when that cereal runs out of stock. So the more that we can cut down on inventory, the more money we save. Well, he doesn't have exact inventory numbers here, but since that stuff was being shipped beforehand, he's just going to assume we had 6 months or we're saving all this time, whatever it is. Let's just assume that half of everything that was shipped before was being stored as inventory. So you were having to ship this stuff during the summer, all that, you're saving this on time. So we're going to take that and say your inventory costs have been reduced by that much. And he goes and figures out all these numbers and says this is $48 million saved. So this is the biggest one so far of the ones that we've calculated, is that saving time by having things quicker, by being able to use the transit system year round. You are saving $48 million. Now, I want you to remember, the most important part of this is the clever way that he solved this problem with time. That now that you can use this more often, that you can get this quicker, how do we do that? How do we calculate the savings? It's through inventory. Incredibly clever solution to do that. I don't care too much about how he calculated it. That's why I haven't dived into this. But just the idea that inventory is what you have when you can't get stuff. And so the quicker you get stuff, the less inventory you have. That's going to be the way that we calculate the savings from railroads. So you also have wagon costs. We didn't really have wagon costs in the original calculation. It was all water plus a little bit. Now he's going to say, like, let's throw on some wagon costs there. Like, you're going to have to take this stuff a little bit farther. And so, through some calculations, he's going to assume that it's like another $20 million for wagon costs. And then the final thing is rivers, canals, they need to be cleaned, they need to be kept up. Like, that is not something that's just calculated into the price. And so he puts another $18 million on there to cover those costs. I want to say that Fogel is being very generous in his estimates. He's just trying to give realistic but also high-end estimates of all these costs. He's trying to bias the stuff against him. And still, even with being so generous in how large these costs are, he can barely get it up to 1% of GDP saved. So Fogel's going to conclude, railroads did just not have that big of an effect on the American economy. Why? Because water transportation was a viable substitute. We already had a network of water transportation that allowed us to do what we needed to do, and railroads just provided a minor improvement on that. And I just, again, want to point out how much cleverness was in all these calculations. First, to find out that the counterfactual is using waterways, that was just really clever, and just think what this world would have been like. Love that. How do we account for lost cargo? Well, let's use insurance rates. How do we account for saved time? Well, let's use inventory. These are really clever ways at getting at this question that people just had not thought of before. This is where thinking like an economist just really shines. Let's think about how sound this logic is. He's being clever, but is it sound logic? Well, his argument says that social savings should be large if there's not a viable alternative, and they're going to be really small when there is. And he finds in the United States that there is. But what about these places where there is not a viable alternative? What about these places where railroads provide really the first transit through the country? I'm thinking of countries like Colombia. Colombia is trisected by 2 mountain ranges. It really divides the country into 3 separate areas. And for a long time, these were 3 completely different regions of Colombia. You really could not travel between them, mostly because these mountains were so treacherous. In fact, these mountains were so treacherous that you couldn't use horses or mules to cross them. And for some people, the best way to get across these mountains was to use cierros. Cierros are these people who literally put people on their back like a backpack. They have this chair and they just carry them. They hike over this mountain for them. And that is safer than using a horse or a mule. If that's the state of transportation in your country, railroads might do something good for you. Well, we're not going to look at Colombia specifically, but let's go ahead and look at Brazil and Mexico. Brazil, although it's filled with rivers, those rivers are far away from the economic center of Brazil, which is out on the coast. There really is not that much transportation available via waterway if you want to get around these coastal areas. Mules were really difficult. You just didn't have that much shipping in these areas. So the prediction is if you put railroads in these areas, you should see a huge impact from those railroads. So an economic historian went through and did the same calculations as Fogel did, but for Brazil. And he just did the first pass. He didn't even go into these clever things of what about lost cargo? What about saving time? Let's just look at the difference of shipping goods before on mules versus trains. And he finds huge social savings. Depending on how you calculate inflation, social savings are about 18 to 32% of GDP. Depending on how you calculate inflation, social savings were about 18 to 38% of GDP. And that's before you do all of these omitted charges. This is just the raw calculation. Brazil had a huge impact from the railroad, and that's what we would expect. They didn't have a viable alternative shipping method. Mexico had a similar system to Brazil. They didn't have a lot of water transportation, and so when they get railroads, we would expect big transformative impacts as well. Well, another economic historian is looking at Mexico and finds social savings on the order of 25 to 39% of Mexican GDP. Again, massive savings from railroads because they didn't have the alternative shipping methods. So what are the key takeaways here? Well, Fogel has this model of how railroads should affect your economy, and the idea is If you have a viable shipping alternative, railroads are not going to have that big of an effect. We looked at places that didn't have viable alternatives and we found huge effects. We look at the United States, we find that there is a viable alternative, and we also find a small effect. This methodology seems to hold up pretty well. Now, this conclusion that railroads did not have a transformative impact on American economic development is still being debated today. Fogel explored it more himself. The highest he was able to get up to was just under 3% of GDP. Some really smart, talented economists were looking at it just a few years ago. They used the best methodology, the best computational power, and they found about the same thing. They found just above 3% of GDP. So it's amazing to me that Fogel's simple methods held up really well against like the cutting edge stuff that we have today. Now, that doesn't mean that question is finalized. We have some people still looking at this today, trying to find out the effects of railroads using different methodology, and we might find new results in a few years. And moreover, Fogel's estimates ignored a lot of other benefits from having railroads. They ignore the fact that you can travel more, that ideas travel faster, that you have value added from different markets, that these railroads are connecting markets and changing prices. He ignored a lot of facts about what happens with the railroad. So there are still a lot of avenues to explore if you're interested in learning more about the effect of railroads on American economic development.